The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this morning's webinar, Gas Rule and Underground Natural Gas Storage Rule Q&A Follow-Up. I'm Marissa Davis, and I'll be facilitating. So this morning's presentation is a follow-up of a webinar that Wally presented a couple weeks ago where he gave a very high-level update on the gas rule. During that webinar, we polled the audience and asked them to provide us with any questions they had or specific topics that they'd like to go into further detail about. So we compiled all of that feedback, and that's what Wally will be presenting on today. If you missed that presentation, you can find that on our website if you go to the Insights tab and then click on Webinars, or you can just reach out to me directly. It's marissa.davis@g2-is.com, and I can email it to you directly. So we will not be taking any live questions this morning, but you can email any questions you have directly to Wally, and he'll provide his contact info at the end of the presentation today. So hope everyone is still staying safe and happy and somewhat have their sanity intact, and let's get started. The host of today's webinar, G2 Integrated Solutions, provides responsive support in a comprehensive suite of asset integrity, engineering, GIS, field services, regulatory, and technology solutions that address asset performance through its life cycle. For more details on our services, please visit our website. And now you can advance to that presenter slide. All right, now I'll introduce you to our presenter, Wally McGaughey. Wally is G2's Director of Regulatory Compliance. He specializes in consulting, inspections, audit support, and training based on the Code of Federal Regulation requirements. He's native of Pennsylvania, but has lived most of his life in Louisiana, where he gained experience in the petrochemical, petroleum, and pipeline industries. Wally's retired from the PHMSA Office of Training and Qualifications. He's got over 40 years of experience in the energy industry, and frequently lectures at state pipeline safety seminars as well as industry organization functions. So with all of that, Wally, you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Good morning, folks. So glad to have you with us. Again, I'll mirror what Marissa said. I hope all are well and surviving through this pandemic that we're experiencing, making your way through the regulations and the requirements of the day-to-day livings as we go about our business. This morning, as she said, we're going to address some of the questions that were sent. And again, at the end of this presentation, my contact information will be there. I would be more than glad to address any questions that you might have. If you'd email those to me, we can have a conversation about those. So the first question that we received, not the first question, but the first question we're going to address here is, if a third-party excavator does a pothole to expose a pipeline, does this constitute an opportunity for an operator to do a TVC examination? And then the following statement was, if it's really practical in this fast-moving world of excavation, is there any enforcement guidance on this issue? And in particular, there was FAQ 24 that is published out there at that website that you see there. Now, those are draft FAQs. They are not final, but they're there. They're on the meetings page where the public meeting was conducted. And it says, during which type of pipeline exposures does an operator need to perform material property attribute verifications? And it talks about, it says, PHMSA does not expect but encourages, if feasible, operators to not delay or interrupt the one-call excavation, but if they can perform material verifications on unknown pipeline properties at that time, they should do so. We do agree that that can become a very difficult time. Someone's out just doing a pothole to identify where your pipeline is for some excavation or activity around your pipeline may not give you opportunity to do those examinations, but should those things move forward, and you have the opportunity to do so, PHMSA would expect you to do so. Okay, and next, this questioner said, I missed the details regarding the process rule is not included in the 1231 extension. It's talking about the stay of enforcement that PHMSA issued on April 22nd. The compliance date in that rule specifically identifies July 1st, 2020, of being a stay of enforcement surrounding that date. The compliance matters surrounding that date have been extended out effectively to 12/31/2020. So what was expected to be completed by July 1st, 2020 can now be completed by December 31st, 2020. However, PHMSA does also state in that same document, they fully expect operators to maintain and continue their work towards compliance. So they would fully expect to see, even though we're involved in this pandemic and we've got isolation going on and staffing has been limited, that they fully expect that operators would have been moving towards compliance with that July 1st, 2020 rule. Next question. Questioner asked, in a recent pipeline incident, a pig was stuck in the barrel. This would be between the isolation valve and that eccentric reducer that's typically in the barrel from contaminants or possibly ice formation. The barrel was blown down, but the pipe between the isolation valve and the barrel was still pressurized. The barrel was opened, the pig became dislodged, exited the barrel through the open hatch, striking the employee. And the question is there any requirement to verify the entire assembly is depressurized or just the barrel? So the rule statement 192.750 says any launcher or receiver used after July 1st, 2021 must be equipped with a device capable of safely relieving pressure in the barrel before removal or opening the receiver barrel closure. So I would suggest to you that that language means that you have to make it safe. And if we have a situation like we see in this very, very basic graphic that's on here, if that pig is stuck in this restricted area and there is pressure between the pig and the isolation valve, that there ought to be a means of indicating what that pressure value should be. And a reasonable assumption would be that that pig had moved far enough up into the barrel that both of those pressure indicators would read the same value, indicating that the pressure had been adequately relieved behind the pig. Now, there's two problems with this question. This statement is, number one, there should have been pressure indicators on both sides of that pig. Number two, never, ever, ever is it acceptable to be in front of that launcher door at any time until that barrel has been completely relieved and we know for certain that there's no pressure in it. I mean, it's the loaded gun, right? You never stand in front of that loaded gun. Same with the launcher and receiver. Next one talks about, can a company use recent TVC studies to be compliant with the rule changes as long as the study was performed with the current requirements? And then they made a statement that says, I'm surprised how much of the mega rule seems to address things that companies currently do. And the rule does state that studies conducted before July 2020 can be used if they comply with the requirements of the regulation. Sufficient procedures and documentation of the study will be required to demonstrate compliance as always. And yes, it is true, and it is talked about in the preamble of the rule, that much of the language in the updated rule, Mega Rule 1, if you will, Section 1, addressed things that PHMSA had already addressed in the integrity management regulations. They just added clarification to those requirements. Next question talks about, if the 15-minute hold for a spike test seems excessive, given research that has suggested a much shorter duration will accomplish the same result. And they want to know, how did PHMSA arrive at this required period? Well, first off, let's make it perfectly clear that we do not speak for PHMSA in any way, shape, or form. However, PHMSA did in the preamble address this very thing. It talks about spike testing in the preamble, and it says you're using a short duration, very high spike pressure followed by a long duration integrity verification pressure provides greater assurance that the test is not growing cracks that could fail in service after the test is completed. It states that PHMSA proposed standards for the spike hydrostatic test in 192.506, and PHMSA used several technical reports and studies, including PHMSA-sponsored research. One of those studies was the ASME Standards Technology Report, Integrity Management of Stress Corrosion, Cracking, and Gas Pipeline High Consequence Areas, and a final summary report, Recommendations for the Comprehensive Study to Understand Longitudinal Seam, ERW seam failures. In those studies, spike pressures ranged anywhere from 5 to 60 minutes in their application. The notice of proposed rulemaking recommended 30-minute spike duration, but in the end, the final rule issued changed that 30 minutes to 15 minutes. Now, I don't know if that answers the questioner's question, if that satisfies their desire, but my recommendation is that they would reach out to PHMSA for that and ask based on what criteria they settled on 15 minutes. Next question says, what are the major downsides of any alternative technology over inline inspection for pipeline integrity assessments? 192.18 addresses notification to PHMSA for a variety of places inside the regulation. When the gas rule was published, alternative technology use is addressed. However, it requires that notification to PHMSA, and it requires specific information to be provided to them. And in some cases, it requires a 90-day waiting period. So the alternative technology typically has to address the recommended practice, provide sufficient information to be comparable in a conservative measure to what the recommended processes would be. So in this particular case, alternative technology over inline inspection, the ILI, the alternative technology would have to provide as good as information as the ILI would provide. Other technology that an operator demonstrates can provide equivalent understanding of the condition of the line pipe is what's necessary. So the difficulty with alternative technology is getting that information gathered that's going to give you comparable information to the provided technology, right? Number one. Number two is making certain that a subject matter expert is involved in that process, and statements to that effect are a part of that procedure and process as provided to them in accordance with 192.18. And then PHMSA can make a decision as to whether or not that alternative technology is acceptable. Next question again talks about required spike testing. Will newer chart boxes be needed to clearly identify the 15-minute spike test, or will 15-minute interval reports be accepted? So in the spike test regulation in 192.517, it says there are specific pieces of information required in the report. Of course, the operator's name, the name of the operator employee responsible for the test, the name of any test company it's used, the test medium, the test pressure, the test duration. Then it talks about pressure recording charts or other record of pressure readings, elevation variations, so on and so forth. But in the procedure itself, it says that 15-minute spike test has to be conducted once the test pressure has been achieved and stabilized. It is then raised to that higher pressure, and once that pressure has stabilized, held for 15 minutes. So I would suggest to you that you know, a chart reading of that test would be necessary as a part of the record for performing the spike test. Next question. If a previous assessment was completed, but not all of the 19 items were recorded or completed as the new rule determines, can they be duplicated, reassessed in order to meet the previous assessment requirement? So the 19 items identified in 192.712 is what we're talking about here. Indicates records you must document, justification, deviations, and determinations made for the following, and it says as applicable. So the first thing you would have to do is determine what information you have of those 19 items. And as applicable, do you have all the necessary information that PHMSA requires to comply with 192.712? If not, then establishing those records, establishing that assessment would be necessary, and to fill in the gaps to be able to claim that previous assessment that was done. Regarding the requirements for organizations to devise their own material testing plans, are there any accepted industry practices in place currently that strike a balance between confidence and cost? So in the preamble to the rule and in the documentation associated with it leading up to this rule, there was no specific circumstances of determining material testing procedures or plans to assess cost, specifically to this part of the rule. No industry practices were identified in the regulations for material testing. The preamble does speak to material property records this way. It says PHMSA considers insufficient material property records to be those records where the pipeline's physical material properties and attributes are not documented in TVC records. So at this time, we're not aware of a study or analysis being done or presented for consideration on the confidence of cost factors for the material testing. That's something I believe that the specific circumstances of your pipeline segment in question would have to be considered. The environment, of course, that your pipeline is in, and the type of risk associated with your pipe and history of operation of your pipe would have to be taken into consideration as to what material testing practices you would follow and procedures you would use. What is PHMSA's stake in the What is PHMSA's take in the situation where an operator just decides to class everything in the highest category of compliance when in actuality it's not in that category, such as if the pipeline's in class 1 and they decide to treat it as class 3 or 4, or if they have MCA locations but they claim they're HCAs. If they report in this way to the regulatory agency, and the regulatory agency then has to include them in the shuffle of actual higher risk pipelines, is that looked at as a problem by PHMSA? Again, I have to say we don't speak for PHMSA, but we'll attempt to answer your question. As with any compliance matter, the regulations as stated on the cover page are the minimum safety requirements that an operator must achieve in order to operate their pipeline. If an operator chooses an alternative compliance approach other than what is prescriptive in the rule, they have to follow a more conservative compliance practice. And the only concern would be that they make certain they do a gap analysis between the two levels of regulatory compliance that they're trying to accomplish, making certain that they follow the most stringent requirements included in both. Be aware, if you do this, if you go to the higher level or the higher degree of compliance, that you have to meet all of those things. Even if your pipeline is not required to by code, you still have to meet those additional measures. The last part of the question would have to be presented to PHMSA for an answer. I don't know about risk. We all know that there's a conversation about risk ranking for inspection practices that PHMSA conducts, but that information is not public information. So I would recommend that the questioner go to PHMSA and ask that question to possibly get an answer there. Next question talks about 192.127. If an operator has a pipeline less than 30% SMYS, not in a class 3 or 4 location, or in an MCA, 192.624 would not be applicable. What would an operator need to do to perform to obtain those records? So we're talking about an operator doesn't have records, because 127 is a records requirement. It states if there are no records, then the operator may be subject to 192.624. It says that because there's applicability statement in 192.624, right? And it talks about the fact that if there are no records, then the operator may be subject to 624. So if the pipeline is in an HCA, according to 903, 624 would apply, because the rule states in 624, it says if there are no TVC records, records necessary to establish the MALP, including records required by a 517 are not TVC, either of the following items have to be done. If you meet these items, are you in an HCA or are you in a class 3 or 4 location? The questioner asked about whether or not they were in a class 3 or 4 or an MCA, which is the second half of the requirements. If the MLP was established in accordance with 619C, the pipeline segment MLP is greater to or equal to 30% of SMYS. Questioner said it was not. So we're going to throw out the fact that it doesn't meet the second half of the requirement, because the rule says either or, right? So if it's in an HCA, then they have to follow those requirements. They do have to follow 624. I hope that answers the question. In 192.623, if an operator can determine the actual material yield but does not have ultimate tensile strength, is the operator still required to perform 607? That's the question. So in accordance with 192.623A24, an engineering critical analysis, it states yield and tensile strength as conditions not known, the operator has to follow 607 or use 30,000 PSI as a factor. So it's got to have both. It needs yield and tensile strength or default to the 30,000 PSI value. In 192.710A2, If a pipeline cannot accommodate an ILI tool and is located in an MCA, would 710 still be applicable? The rule section states that applicability is for pipelines operating at equal or greater to 30% SMYS. They're located in either 1, 2, or 3, that's listed in the regulation. Number 2 states that if it is in an MCA and can accommodate inspection by an ILI, so if the pipeline cannot accommodate an ILI, it would stand to reason the section would not apply. However, you are required to make piggable segments of your pipeline that are not when modifications or repairs are made in accordance with 192-150. So as we move forward in time, for those areas that meet that requirement, they are in an MCA, but they cannot accommodate an ILI. At some point in time, as modifications and repairs are made, that pipeline segment is going to need to be made piggable. 192.712. An operator has a grandfathered section of pipe operating at 22% SMYS, and the operator has an anomaly. Would the operator be required to follow 712E, which requires to use 607? That's the first question. The stated purpose of this section of the code or the regulation is to predict the failure pressure of an identified anomaly in order to perform analysis. TVC records are required. So if the anomaly falls into consideration of 712, then 712E would apply. Now, depending on, it says, would an operator have to perform 712 if they fix the leak per the pipe specs listed previously? Well, that depends on what the leak was, right? The character of the leak. If it's corrosion or a crack-like defect, then it would be considered as an anomaly under the requirements of 712. So that 712 would then have to be followed, and 607. Next question. 192.917.3. If an operator has a pre-code grandfathered pipeline with 0 pressure changes, no seam issues, no cyclic issues, would an operator have to perform a hydro test at 1.25 times to be considered stable? Okay, so this is a pipeline that's operating in perfection. Anyway, all kidding aside. E3 refers to manufacturing defects or construction defects are being considered for analysis or the risk of failure that it may have posed to the pipeline segment in question. The regulation states an operator may consider manufacturing and construction related defects to be stable defects only if the segment covered has been subjected to a hydrostatic pressure testing. So in this particular case, you can only consider those potential construction manufacturing related defects to be stable defects, right? If they are have been hydro tested at 1.25 is what the requirements are. That's subpart J. So the stable defects are only stable if they've been subjected to hydrostatic pressure testing. And that, folks, is the last question that we have that we're going to address today. I hope that it's been helpful to you. There's my contact information, my email address, wallace.mcgaughey@g2-is.com. And of course, my cell phone is available to you should you have a call, want to make a call, to be glad to have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Wally. We hope you all enjoyed the presentation. I'll be sending out a copy of the presentation today, as long as a link to the recording. So be on the lookout for that. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, or at least I think it's Tuesday. The days all seem to be running together, but thank you for joining us, and we will see you back next week. Thank you.